When you implement a new codec, the benefits of that codec are only going to be delivered for the small number of devices that support it. So VVC sounds great today, it's 50% benefit over HEVC, but it might be 0.5% of all TVs on the market, which means that you're not going to get a lot of savings because it's such a small group of targets out there. Encoding and storage costs are always going to be additive, meaning you're going to have to continue to support H.264, you're going to continue to have to support HEVC for your legacy devices, and the encoding costs that you undertake for the newer codec are always going to be much more expensive than existing codecs because they're much more complex. Whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're paying for it, you're going to spend a lot more to encode to the new technologies. And again, as I mentioned, you still have to encode for the legacy codecs. The other factors are bandwidth costs have dropped very, very significantly. I remember 15 years ago, bandwidth was between 50 cents and $1 per gigabyte, per gigabyte. And now it's at the lowest cost structure on CloudFront is like 2 cents a gigabyte. It takes a lot of savings at 2 cents a gigabyte to make up for the cost of implementation. And those are getting higher and higher. And then there's the risk. What we have is working. We're currently distributing with H.264, maybe a little HEVC. It's all working. The players work. Customers are happy. Nobody's complaining. So why do we want to change it? As I mentioned, the costs are going to increase in the short term if you deploy a new codec because you're adding storage costs and you're adding encoding costs. The codec may not deliver the expected savings. If you don't take into account what I talked about in the ladder, you may think, great, VVC is going to give us 50%, but it may not deliver that benefit at all. You may see player failures or reduced QoE, which is one of the things that Facebook experienced when they implemented Reels with AV1. They found that some Android phones couldn't play it back smoothly, so they had to start doing some testing before they distributed AV1 to those phones to avoid drop frames and reduce battery life. And then there's always a new codec coming. I think AV1 really stalled VP9 deployment. I mean, if it's 2019, do we want to deploy VP9? Well, AV1's right around the corner. And then we had 3 MPEG codecs released within 18 months of each other. So I mean, how do you choose? How do you go forward with this type of with these choices always seeming to be coming? And the bottom line is, and I'll say this again and again and again during the talk, is that few publishers deploy new codecs to chase short-term bandwidth savings. Codecs seem to flourish best when they enable publishers to enter new markets. And we saw that very definitely with 4K and HDR. A lot of people went to HEVC because 4K made no sense with H.264, and it was impossible with H.264 to deliver Dolby Vision. So that was the major migration to HEVC, not bandwidth savings. Go ahead.
You spoke about encoding and storage costs. Are there transmission costs, or is that?
Well, the bandwidth costs are the costs that are going to be reduced. So that is the savings. But as I pointed out in that chart, it's only going to be for the top rung. It's not going to be for any rungs below that.
No, but you spoke about encoding costs and storage costs.
Correct.
Are there also transmission costs, or is that negligible?
When you say transmission, do you mean transmission?
Content delivery network and to these publishers?
I mean, there's some of that, but I don't think that's going to be a major. So there are some very notable exceptions. In the US, YouTube, Meta, Netflix all started shipping out VP9 and AV1. Primarily, I think, with VP9, a lot of that was bandwidth savings. With AV1, perhaps it was, supporting the Alliance for Open Media. In China today, we're seeing a lot of use of VVC with, happens to be VVC stakeholders. So, Kuai, ByteDance, Tencent are all big VVC IP owners, and they are starting to distribute to software players with VVC. And in India, we're seeing the MX player distributed VVC. India is one of those instances where there's very, very low bandwidth, so maybe a lower bandwidth codec makes sense. On the other hand, there's also a ton of cheap Android phones that really can't play back HEVC, much less VVC. So there's always those type of considerations. And as I say, the decision to use AV1, I think, was politically motivated by a bunch of companies in the Alliance for Open Media, because even when it took a year to encode a minute of video, Netflix and YouTube were deploying AV1, clearly before it was commercially ready.